When the temperature dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit in Reykjavik, Iceland, on the night of February 14, 1973, nobody in their right mind should have been standing outside. But 48,000 people were. They came from 12 countries. They spent money they didn't have. They wore every piece of warm clothing they owned. And they stood so still, so completely, totally still, that you could hear the ice cracking at the center of the stadium, because something was about to happen that the world had never seen before and would never see again. On one side of that frozen circle stood a man the whole world already knew. Bruce Lee, the most dangerous human being alive. A man so fast that cameras couldn't properly capture him, and so precise that engineers who tested his striking power put their clipboards down and looked at each other without speaking. A man who had spent his entire life searching for the one true thing inside fighting, and who believed quietly and without any performance that he could defeat any man on earth. He had never met a reason to doubt that, until now. Because on the other side of that circle stood a man most of the world had never heard of. A fisherman from Iceland. No gym, no trainer, no system with a name. Just a man built by the North Atlantic Sea, by 4 in the morning hauls, by timber split with bleeding hands, by 63 fights across 5 countries that had all ended the same way. With the other man on the ground and this man still standing, still calm, or he's still wearing the same face he always wore, like a cliff above the water that has seen too many storms to be impressed by one more. His name was Thorstein Bjornvik. They called him the Viking, and he had never lost. Not once, not ever, not even close. Bruce Lee had watched the film footage of Thorstein 6 times in a dark room in Hong Kong, leaning forward in his chair, his tea going cold beside him. And when it finished, he said 3 words to the man next to him. "I want him." What came next was 11 secret days together in a freezing boat shed that neither man ever fully described to anyone. A series of letters crossing the world. A challenge that made the front pages of sports sections in 11 countries. And one night, one extraordinary, frozen, or star-filled night, when 48,000 people held their breath and watched 2 men walk toward each other across the ice. One of those men did not walk away the same. And what happened in those 22 minutes? What was said without words, what was felt without being able to explain it, and what Bruce Lee wrote in a 3-sentence note that one man carried in his inside pocket every single day for 24 years, is the most astonishing thing you will hear today. Stay with this video all the way to the end, because the answer to who won, the real answer, the one that changes everything you think you know about this night, is not what you expect. It never was. This is the story of the night the undefeated Viking challenged Bruce Lee at 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and 48,000 spectators were left completely speechless. Before we begin, the promise. On the night of February 14, 1973, in the open-air stadium of Reykjavik, Iceland, the temperature was 15 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that burns your lungs when you breathe in. The kind that turns the ground to iron and makes the ice groan under your boots like something alive and angry. 48,000 people sat in that cold without moving. They had come from 12 countries. They had spent money they couldn't afford and traveled distances that made no sense. And they sat wrapped in every layer they owned, with their breath rising above them in white clouds. And they watched 2 men walk toward each other across the ice at the center of the stadium. One was Bruce Lee, the most dangerous man alive by any honest accounting. A man who had turned his own body into an argument against everything people thought they knew about size and weight and what a human being was capable of. The other was a man most of the world had never heard of, a fisherman from Iceland, undefeated in 63 fights across 5 countries. No manager, no team, no gym with a name over the door. Just a man who had come up out of the North Atlantic cold with something in his hands and his eyes that no one had ever been able to answer. They called him the Viking. One of those 2 men did not walk away from the ice the same person. Which one? You will not find out until the final page. That is a promise. The breath came first. One single white puff of air rising from the mouth of a 17-year-old boy into the dark above Reykjavik, Iceland. It floated up slow and quiet, the way smoke rises from something that has just stopped burning. and then the wind off the North Atlantic took it apart, and it was gone. The boy's name was Torsten Bjørnvik. It was January 3rd, 1958. The temperature that night was somewhere nobody wanted to measure. The stone steps outside his father's fishing house were slick with frost, and Torsten stood on them with no shoes on, looking down at his own two hands like they belonged to someone he hadn't met yet. They were bleeding, not from a fight, not from anything dramatic, from the wood. He had been splitting timber in the yard for 4 hours without gloves because his father, Sigurd Bjørnvik, believed in a very simple idea, that comfort was the first enemy of strength, and a man who learned to feel everything, cold, pain, sort of the weight of work, was a man who could not be taken by surprise. Sigurd was not a cruel father. He was a father who had been shaped entirely by the sea and by loss, and he handed both of those things down to his only son the way you hand down a coat, because the weather is coming and the boy's going to need it. Torsten was not tall at 17. He stood a full head shorter than the men who worked alongside his father on the boats. But his shoulders were something else. They were the kind of shoulders that made older, bigger men go quiet when he walked into a room without quite knowing why. Shoulders built by 4 in the morning hauls, by nets that weighed as much as a grown man, by water that was always angry and always black and never once forgave you for being tired. His mother Astrid had died when he was 9 years old. Fever, 3 days. The first day she was warm and still talking. The second day she was hot and not talking. The third day she was gone. There was no warning that prepared you for the specific shape of that kind of absence. The way her chair at the table stayed wrong for years. The way her voice kept appearing in his head in the mornings before he was fully awake, giving him a few perfect seconds before he remembered. He did not talk about his mother. He did not talk about much at all, really. After she died, Torsten's world became two things: the sea and the fighting. Not boxing, not wrestling, not anything with a referee and a rule book and a ribbon at the end. The real kind of fighting. The kind that started on the docks when the Norwegian ships came into port and the crews got drunk and somebody said the wrong thing to somebody else and the wrong thing went sideways fast. Torsten got into his first real fight at 11 years old against a 16-year-old Norwegian deckhand named Petter, who had shoved Sigurd into a barrel of salted herring in front of 6 other men. Torsten hit him once with the flat of his palm, square in the face. He heard something crack. Petter sat down on the dock and stayed there, looking at the sky and not saying anything. Torsten stood over him and looked at his own hand. He was not angry. He was not proud. He was something else entirely. Something he didn't have a name for yet. A kind of calm that felt larger than him, that seemed to come from somewhere older than his 11 years. Like a river that had been running underground a long time before it finally broke through the surface. That was the first time he understood what he was. By 15, nobody on the docks fought him anymore. Not because he hunted it, not because he was loud or threatening or hard to be around. He was quiet. He was polite. He helped older fishermen with their nets without being asked. But when something real came, when it got past talking and past warnings and into the place where only one true thing could happen, Torsten was somewhere else, somewhere calm and cold and absolutely clear, the way the eye of a storm is clear, while everything around it destroys itself. Word of it traveled. Sailors from the Reykjavik docks carried the stories to Bergen, to Stavanger, to Oslo, to Copenhagen, told them in port bars and on ship decks. There is a boy in Iceland, they said. Big shoulders, quiet eyes, hands that feel like stone paddles when they connect. Nobody beats him. Nobody even comes close. They called him the Viking. He had never asked for the name. It was just the name that happened, the way certain names happen. They start somewhere in the crowd and spread outward until they reach the person they belong to, and by that point, the person doesn't have a choice about it anymore. By the time Torsten was 19 and running his own boat, the Viking was the only name anyone at the harbor used. His father heard it for the first time at a tavern near the water and said nothing then. But that night, Torsten found Sigurd sitting alone in the dark kitchen with his hands flat on the table and his eyes bright with something he was working hard not to show. When Sigurd never explained it, Torsten never asked. In 1963, when Torsten was 22 and the stories had crossed into 5 countries, A sports promoter named Halvard Rhine arrived at the Reykjavik docks. Halvard wore a coat that cost more than most of the men there made in a full month. He smelled of pipe tobacco and of plans. He had a leather folder under one arm and had been hearing the stories for 3 years and had come to find out if they were real. He watched Torsten unload a full cargo net by himself, work that normally took 3 men, and made up his mind before the net touched the dock. "I want to put you in front of an audience," Halvard said. Torsten looked at him with those quiet eyes for a long, flat moment. "Doing what?" "Fighting. I already do that for free." "Yes," Halvard said and smiled. That is exactly the problem we are here to fix." What followed were 7 years that had no clean name in the sporting world. Not boxing, not wrestling. Something rawer and truer than both. Torsten fought any man who wanted to try, in warehouses and on ships and on a frozen lake outside Oslo in 1966, with 200 Norwegian farmers standing in a circle stamping their feet for warmth. He never lost. Not once, not ever, not a draw. Some men lasted 30 seconds. A Swedish logger named Gunnar Holst lasted 41 minutes, and at the end of it, both men shook hands and Gunnar said it felt like arguing with a glacier. You could push it, it never moved. By 1970, the Viking was undefeated in 63 recorded fights across 5 countries. He was 32 years old. His face was angular and weathered and calm, almost like a cliff above the sea. He had money now, more than Sigurd had ever seen. A house with good windows and a good stove. A gray wolfhound named Frost, who slept across his feet every night. A woman named Ragna who worked at the hospital and who understood, without ever needing to say it out loud, that Torsten was not a man you changed. He was a man you simply knew. In 1970, he looked like a man who had arrived somewhere, like the story was finished. He was wrong, because on the other side of the world, in a room in Hong Kong, a man named Bruce Lee was sitting in the dark with a film projector running and his tea going cold on the table beside him. On the screen in front of him was footage of Torsten Bjornvik ending a fight in 11 seconds. Bruce watched it once, then he rewound it and watched it again, and then 3 more times after that, leaning forward in his chair, his dark eyes absolutely still. He set down his tea. He turned to the man sitting beside him and said 3 words. "I want to meet him." The year was 1971, and Bruce Lee was not yet a legend the way legends are made after people are gone. He was becoming one in real time, right now, while he was still breathing and eating and training and arguing and making films and filling notebooks with ideas that moved faster than the ink could keep up. The strange thing, the thing that separated him from almost every other famous person alive, was that he seemed to be the only one who understood exactly what was happening and why. He watched his own rise the way a navigator watches a coastline, calmly, with full attention, without getting lost in it. He was 30 years old. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 135 pounds on a heavy day. His body was something that fitness scientists would study for decades after he was gone. The body fat percentage so low it bordered on fiction. The reaction time so fast it had been measured in laboratories and written about in terms usually reserved for machines. The striking power so wildly out of proportion with his size that engineers who tested it actually set down their clipboards and looked at each other in silence for a moment before writing anything down. But the body was not the point. The body was just what the thinking lived inside. What made Bruce Lee who he was the thinking. He had spent his entire adult life trying to find the real truth inside fighting. Not the performed version, not the tournament version with its points and its bowing and its ceremonies. Not the movie version where everything was choreographed to look dangerous rather than be dangerous. The actual truth, the thing underneath all the systems and the styles and the traditions, the bare fact of it. He called what he had built Jeet Kune Do, which means roughly the way of the intercepting fist. But calling it a fighting style was like calling the ocean a large puddle. It was a philosophy that happened to express itself through the body. Its central law was simple and merciless. Adapt. Strip away everything false. Keep only what is real. Use what works. Discard everything else, no matter how beautiful or traditional or beloved it is. If it doesn't work, it is a lie, and a lie in a real fight will get you hurt. He had studied Wing Chun and boxing and fencing and wrestling and karate and a dozen other systems. He had taken the pieces of each that were real and thrown the rest away. He trained alone for hours every day in ways that his peers found obsessive and that he found simply obvious. He believed, truly without theater, that in a real fight against any man alive, he would win. Not because he was arrogant, because he had tested the idea over 15 years, from every angle he could find, and the evidence kept agreeing with him. And then Desmond Kwok walked through his door with a film canister. Desmond was a Hong Kong film distributor, a small, cheerful man who dealt mostly in legitimate cinema and occasionally in the stranger corners of the sports footage world. He had acquired a reel from a contact in Oslo who had shot it on a handheld camera at a waterfront event in 1969. The contact thought it might have entertainment value. Desmond had watched it once, decided it was too rough and too strange for regular distribution, and had been about to shelve it when he remembered that Bruce Lee had once told him he was interested in any footage of real fighting. Not performed fighting, real fighting. So he brought it over on a Tuesday afternoon and set up the projector in Bruce's training room. "It's a man called Bjornvik," Desmond said. "Norwegian, I think, or Icelandic. They call him the Viking. You probably won't find it useful, but..." "Stay," Bruce said, "or go, but let it run." Desmond went. He had learned to read the room. Bruce watched the 11-second fight first. He watched it once without moving. Then he rewound it and watched it again. Then a third time. Then he let the reel continue. The 41-minute fight with Gunnar Holst, then 6 shorter ones. He watched all of them without getting up, without looking away, without saying a single word. His tea went cold on the table beside him, and he didn't notice. After the last reel ended, he sat in the dark for a long time, and then rewound to the 11-second fight and watched it 3 more times. What troubled him, and very few things in this world genuinely troubled Bruce Lee, was not the power or the size or the physical fact of Torsten Bjornvik. Those things were real, but they were explainable. What troubled him was the face. The Viking didn't fight with anger. He didn't fight with hunger. He fought with something that looked, from the outside, almost like sadness. Like a man who already knew how the next 10 seconds would go and found that knowledge heavy rather than thrilling. His eyes during those 11 seconds were calm in a way Bruce had only ever seen in one other place. In the mirror, on his best days, when the training had brought him somewhere very quiet and very clear, and the noise of the world had stopped reaching him. He had never seen that look on anyone else. He stood up, rewound to the final 3 seconds of the 11-second fight, and watched Torsten's face one more time. That slight heaviness around the eyes. That stillness that was not emptiness, but fullness. A man not blocking out the world, but holding all of it in at once calmly without it costing him anything. He picked up the phone, dialed. It rang for a long time. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was foggy with sleep. "Niels," Bruce said. "I need you to find a man for me." Niels Svensson was a Norwegian-Swedish journalist in Stockholm. Lean, sharp, occasionally brilliant. A writer who covered martial arts and combat sports for a magazine that paid poorly and published things worth reading. He and Bruce had met 2 years earlier at a seminar in Tokyo and had kept in touch in the irregular, genuine way of people who actually liked each other rather than needing something from each other. "What time is it?" Niels said. 4 in the morning. His name is Torsten Bjornvik. They call him the Viking. He's in Iceland. I want to speak with him." A pause, then, more awake. "Bruce, I know who he is. Everyone in Scandinavia knows who he is." "Good, can you reach him?" "I can try." "But listen, this man is not in your world. He's not a martial artist. He doesn't care about tournaments. He doesn't want attention." "I know," Bruce said. "Then why?" "Because of his face," Bruce said. "In the film, his face when he fights." Niels was quiet for a moment on the other end. He was a journalist. He understood the weight of a detail given instead of withheld. "I'll find him," Niels said. It took 6 weeks. The trail went through Halvard Rhine, through 2 phone calls and a letter, and finally arrived at Torsten on a Tuesday morning in April, while he was repairing a net outside the boat shed. Halvard drove down to the harbor and read the message aloud. Torsten kept his hands on the net and his eyes on the work. He wants to meet you, Halvard finished. Just meet, talk, no cameras, no press, no announcement. Just see. Torsten was quiet for a moment. Who is he? Halvard blinked. Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee. He's the most famous. I know who he is, Torsten said quietly. He had seen the poster in Reykjavik the previous November, outside the cinema on Laugavegur Street. He had not gone in. He almost never went to films. But he had stood in front of that poster longer than he meant to, in the cold November dark, looking at the face on it. There was something in that face he recognized. Not the man, not the fame or the story. Just the thing behind the eyes. The same kind of stillness he saw in his own reflection on the rare mornings he stopped long enough to look. He picked up the net again. Tell him to come here, he said. Bruce Lee arrived in Reykjavik on a Thursday in September 1971. Ahen in the cold hit him like a wall the moment he stepped off the plane. He stopped on the tarmac and stood still for a moment, just breathing it in. The sky above Iceland was a flat, heavy gray, sitting so low it felt like a ceiling pressed down on purpose. The lava field stretched out beyond the airport fence, black and ancient and dusted with frost, a landscape that looked like it had been there since before the idea of people. The smell was the sea, everywhere, in everything. Not the warm, salt smell of tropics, but something colder and older and deeply serious. Like the ocean was trying to tell you something about permanence. He had traveled to many countries. He had never been anywhere that felt quite this much like the beginning of time. Niels Svensson was waiting by the exit doors, holding a very large coat. His expression said quite clearly that he already knew Bruce Lee was not going to put it on. He was right. Bruce draped it over one arm and walked out into the Icelandic morning in his thin jacket, not shivering, not hurrying, moving through the cold the way he moved through everything, like it was something to be understood rather than avoided. The car is here, Niels said, pulling his own collar up. The harbor is 20 minutes. Good, Bruce said. He was already looking at the road ahead. Halvard had arranged the meeting at Torsten's boat shed, neutral ground, or rather, Torsten's ground, which was the only kind Torsten recognized. When they pulled up to the harbor, Torsten was already outside. He stood with his back to the road, looking out at the water, wearing the same clothes he wore every day. Heavy canvas trousers, a dark wool sweater, boots that had been resoled 3 times and would be resoled again. He did not turn when the car stopped. He did not turn when the doors opened. He was not being rude. He was simply not the kind of man who turned toward things before he was ready. Bruce got out and walked toward him and stopped about 3 feet away. They stood there in the cold sea air, the small, electric, precisely assembled man from Hong Kong and the large, dense, weathered man from the North Atlantic docks, and looked at each other for the first time in the flesh. It was like watching 2 different kinds of storm meet at the edge of a coast. Different systems entirely, both of them real. You are smaller than the films, Torsten said. It was not an insult. It was an observation, delivered in the flat. In an honest way, Torsten delivered everything. You are exactly like the film, Bruce said, because there are no films of you that lie. Something moved in Torsten's face, not a full smile, something that lived just behind one, like a light on the other side of a curtain. Rana had left a pot of coffee on the iron stove inside the boat shed. They sat on upturned wooden crates and drank it black and talked for 4 hours straight, and almost none of it was about fighting. They talked about the sea first. Bruce asked questions and Torsten answered them. About the North Atlantic in winter, about what it cost you to haul nets in water that cold, about what you learned about your own body when the body had no choice but to keep working, then about training, then slowly and carefully, the way men move toward the things that matter most to them, about fathers. Torsten told Bruce about Sigurd, about the wood splitting at night without gloves, about the dark kitchen after the tavern, and the old man's wet eyes over a name he never gave his son permission to carry. There was no complaint in the telling. Torsten was not a man who told stories to be pitied. He told them the way you tell a weather report, as true things that had happened and shaped the ground. Bruce told Torsten about Li Hoi Chuen, the Cantonese opera singer who could fill a theater and empty a room with the same talent, depending on his mood. About growing up between Hong Kong and San Francisco, a Chinese boy who belonged completely to neither city and had spent years being told in two languages, and that there were limits on what he was allowed to become. He told it without bitterness either, the way Torsten had told his, as the raw material the rest of a life was built from. By the time the coffee pot was empty and the light through the boat shed windows had turned from cold white to cold gold, both men understood something they had not been told and could not have been told. They were the same kind of person, not the same person, as different as two men could be in almost every visible way, but the same kind. Both had arrived by roads that looked nothing alike at the same place inside themselves. A place where fighting was not about winning or proving or impressing, where it was about seeing what was real and answering it honestly. They did not spar that day, they did not need to. But at the end of the 4 hours, Bruce set down his cup and looked at Torsten directly. Warm and serious at once, both things fully present, neither canceling the other. "I want to understand what you do," he said, "not watch it, feel it, from the inside. Will you work with me for a few days?" Torsten was quiet for a long moment, the way he was quiet before every answer that mattered. Not hesitating, but making sure the answer was true before he gave it. "For how long?" he said. "However long it takes." "And then?" Bruce paused. Outside, the sea moved against the harbor stones with the steady, indifferent patience of something that would outlast everything in the room. "Then we will know something true," he said. Torsten nodded once. That was the whole answer. What followed were 11 days that neither man ever described in full to anyone. Not to Halvard, not to Niels, not to Ragna, who noticed the change in Torsten when it was over but asked nothing, because she had learned long ago that the things most worth knowing about him arrived in their own time, or not at all. They worked in the boat shed. They worked on the docks. They worked on the frozen beach south of the harbor where the wind came straight off the open ocean with nothing in its way and made every movement cost twice what it cost anywhere else, which was exactly the point. They pushed against each other slowly, then with full speed, then slowly again. They talked between rounds and sometimes during them. They were silent for long stretches in ways that were not empty but full. The silence of two people listening to the same frequency nobody else could hear. On the 9th day, something happened in the boat shed. Nobody knows what it was. Only two people ever knew, and neither of them said. What is known, because Halvard saw the aftermath when he stopped by that evening, is that Torsten was standing against the far wall of the shed with an expression that nobody who knew him had ever seen on his face before, and Bruce Lee was sitting cross-legged on the floor, looking at his own hands, not speaking, for a full minute, maybe more. On the 11th day, Bruce packed his bag and they shook hands at the harbor. The handshake lasted longer than handshakes last. When the car pulled away, Niels asked how it had gone, and Bruce watched Torsten's silhouette through the back window, standing where they had left him, not moving. Looking at the departing car the way he looked at the sea, like something known and necessary, and not entirely understood. "There is one man in the world," Bruce said slowly, "who fights the way I think about fighting. I just spent 11 days with him." Niels waited. "He is better at the things I have not yet mastered," Bruce said, "and I am better at the things he has not yet mastered." "So it's a draw," Niels said, because Niels was a journalist and journalists need conclusions. Bruce turned from the window. His face was doing something Niels had never quite seen it do before. Something complicated and alive and not resolved. "No," he said quietly, "not a draw, an invitation." Niels wrote that line in his notebook that evening without understanding it. He would not understand it for another year. 18 months passed. Or they pass the way time passes when two people are changed by the same experience, but processing it in different rooms on opposite sides of the world, quietly, internally, in ways that didn't show on the outside right away, but were rebuilding everything underneath. In Hong Kong, Bruce Lee released Enter the Dragon and became something the world had not quite seen before. Not just a famous person, not just a famous fighter or a famous actor. Something larger and stranger than either. A global icon, a physical idea, a name that crossed every language barrier and arrived on the other side still electric and intact. His face was on magazine covers in countries that shared nothing culturally, except that every person who lived in them had, at some point in those 18 months, when watched him move and felt something shift in their understanding of what a human body was capable of. He was everywhere. He was also, underneath all of it, still sitting in a dark room in Hong Kong, watching a reel of film from Iceland and thinking about the 9th day. During those same 18 months in Reykjavik, Torsten Bjornvik did two things. He fished and he trained. This was not new. He had always done both. But the 11 days in the boat shed had changed something in the training, shifted its direction in ways that were small and specific, and would only become visible much later, under pressure. He added speed work, not because he believed speed would be the thing that decided anything. He had never believed that. But because the 11 days had shown him a gap, a place where something he thought was fast enough was not fast enough against someone who had turned speed into a language. He was not going to speak that language. He was too old and too different for that, but he needed to understand its grammar. He drilled footwork for 2 months straight on the frozen beach south of the harbor. Every morning before the boats went out, in the dark and the cold, with Frost the wolfhound running alongside him looking baffled and loyal in equal measure, out and back across the frost-hardened sand, changing direction, changing weight, making the feet honest, making them ready for ice. Rana watched all of it and said nothing. That was one of the reasons he loved her. She understood that some things needed to be done in silence, and that asking about them was not the same as caring about them. She cared. She simply knew the difference. In March of 1973, a letter arrived at Halvard's office. It had been forwarded from a production company address in Hong Kong, sealed in a plain envelope, written on plain paper in the small, precise, fully legible hand that people who knew Bruce Lee would recognize instantly. Halvard held it for half a day, which was longer than Halvard usually held anything, before he drove it down to the harbor and read it aloud to Torsten, who was sitting in the boat shed with a net across his knees. Torsten could read English, but Halvard had a habit of reading things aloud that had started years ago and that Torsten tolerated because it was easier than breaking it. The letter said this: I have been thinking about what we found in 11 days. I believe we found the edge of something, not the end of something. I am asking if you are willing to show the world what happens at that edge. Not for money, not for fame. I have enough of both, and they are not the point, for the truth of it. Because I believe that what you and I understand, if we bring it together in front of people, will be something that has never been seen and will not be seen again. I am asking you to fight me. Not a demonstration, not an exhibition, a real fight under real conditions wherever you choose in whatever weather you want, with as few rules as we can agree on. One condition only: it must mean something to both of us. I am not interested in entertainment. I am interested in what is true. Write back if you are willing. Bruce Halvard finished and looked up. Sir Torsten was looking at the floor. The boat shed stove had gone low and needed wood. Outside on the dock, Frost was barking at something, probably the seal that came in every Tuesday morning and slept on the far mooring post like it owned the harbor. Well, Halvard said. Torsten said nothing for so long that Halvard genuinely began to wonder if he had simply decided not to respond at all. Not out of rudeness. Torsten was not a rude man, but he was a man who believed deeply and without apology that a silent answer was still an answer. You know what this would become, Halvard said carefully, feeling his way. If this happened, the attention alone would. I know what it would become, Torsten said. Then, get me paper. He wrote the reply himself in English, which took 3 drafts because he crossed out anything that was more than necessary. The final version was 4 sentences and 1 condition. I will fight you, here in Iceland in February when the cold is real and the ground is what it is. No more than 3 rules. No biting, no eye strikes, no weapons. Everything else is what it is. If you are asking because you want to win, do not come. If you are asking because you want to know, come. Torsten Bjornvik. He gave it to Halvard on a Thursday. The reply from Hong Kong arrived the following Wednesday. It was 2 words on a half sheet of plain paper. I'm coming. What happened next was what always happens when 2 significant things decide to collide. The world learned about it before either man was ready for the world to know. The news escaped through a crack that was never identified precisely. Perhaps Halvard's office. Perhaps Neil Svensson, who had a journalist's constitutional weakness for a true story and who managed to keep this one for exactly 6 days before telling his editor something he described as vague that became entirely specific by the time it moved through the wire services. Within 2 weeks, the story had run in sports pages across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, Hong Kong, and the United States. The headlines varied by country, but the bones were always the same. The undefeated Viking versus Bruce Lee. Iceland, February 14th. Open air, real conditions, no judges. Halvard's telephone did not stop ringing. Sports promoters from 6 countries, 3 American television networks, film studios in Hong Kong. So a German newspaper wanting exclusive photography rights. And the call that made Halvard sit down slowly and stare at the wall for a full minute? The personal secretary to the King of Norway, calling to ask whether His Majesty might attend. He drove to the harbor in a state of organized panic and laid all of it out for Torsten, who listened to every piece of it without changing expression. "How many people does the stadium hold?" Torsten asked when Halvard finished. "The open-air stadium, in February. Torsten, it'll be 15 degrees below freezing. Nobody's going to want to." "How many?" A pause. "If it's full, 48,000. But then fill it," Torsten said. He hung up the phone. Then he stared at the wall himself for a moment. Not in panic, the way Halvard had, but in the way of a man checking an internal compass to see if the needle was still pointing where he expected. It was. He called Ragna at the hospital. She answered on the second ring, her voice in the particular calm register of someone in the middle of a shift who has learned to answer unexpected calls without alarm. He told her, all of it, Bruce Lee, February 14th, 48,000 people, the open stadium, 15 degrees below freezing. There was a long pause on the other end, a genuine one, not dramatic, just Ragna thinking, which she did thoroughly and without rushing. "Will you win?" she asked. He considered that honestly, the way he considered everything, not looking for the answer that sounded right, but for the one that was true. "I don't know," he said. Another pause. Then her voice came back, and it held something in it that was warm and certain and entirely, specifically Ragna. "Good," she said. "That's the first interesting fight you've had in years." The line went quiet. He sat with the phone in his hand after she hung up, in the cold boat shed, the stove still needing wood, frost still barking at the seal outside, the February light coming gray and low through the one small window. Something was moving in his chest. Not fear. He had no real architecture for fear, had never built it. Not excitement exactly. Something older and quieter than excitement. Something that had been sitting very still inside him for a very long time, patient the way deep water is patient, waiting for the moment when the question it had always been the answer to would finally be asked out loud. That moment, he understood now, was coming. A February 14th, 15 degrees, the ice. The world was not ready for this, not because it was unprecedented. There had been cross-discipline contests before, boxers against wrestlers, judoka against karate men, exhibitions with more ambition than truth behind them. The combat sports world had seen plenty of those. They came and went and left behind statistics and arguments and a faint smell of disappointment. This was different. People knew it was different before they could explain why. They set down their breakfast and read the same newspaper paragraph twice. Not because the words were confusing, but because the feeling underneath the words was something they had not felt before. When reading about a fight, it was not excitement. It was not the hot, forward-leaning hunger that boxing promoters manufactured and sold. It was something quieter and more serious. The feeling of something true about to happen. The feeling of 2 men who actually meant it. Journalists who had covered every major combat sporting event of the past 20 years wrote about it in terms that surprised them when they read their own drafts back. They reached for language usually reserved for natural phenomena, for events, for things that were going to matter later. A senior sports editor at a London paper sent his best writer to Iceland 6 weeks early and told him not to come back until he understood what was actually happening. The writer filed 3 dispatches. None of them mentioned technique, statistics, or odds. All 3 of them tried, in different ways, to describe the feeling of a world leaning forward in its chair. A 14-year-old boy in Oslo named Erik Selberg read the first news story on a Tuesday morning before school. He read it once, then read it again, then folded the newspaper carefully and put it in his school bag. On the way home that afternoon, he stopped at the post office and asked how much a ferry ticket to Reykjavik cost. It was more than he had. He started saving that evening, every coin he could find or earn, and he told no one, not his parents, not his friends, because he understood instinctively that some decisions become harder to keep once you start explaining them. He was going to Iceland in February if it took everything he owned. In Osaka, Japan, a 60-year-old martial arts instructor named Fujimoto Kenji read about it in a sports magazine while drinking tea after his morning class. He read it straight through. I set the magazine down on the table and then did something he had not done in 30 years of teaching. He told his afternoon class it was canceled, walked out into his small garden, and sat on the wooden bench by the stone basin and thought about what this contest meant. Not who would win, what it meant. About the 2 rivers of understanding. One running through the ancient disciplines of the East, one carved out of raw northern cold and dockside reality, meeting in a frozen stadium. About what the water looked like when those 2 rivers joined. He sat in the garden for 3 hours. When his wife brought him dinner, he was still there. In Aberdeen, Scotland, a 31-year-old doctoral student named Margaret Harlow cut the article from her newspaper with scissors, carefully along the column edges, and pinned it to the wall above her desk. She was writing a thesis on the philosophy of combat, on the question of whether fighting, at its highest expression, was a form of knowledge rather than simply a physical event. She had been writing it for 4 years. She had been looking all that time for a real-world example that could carry the weight of what she was arguing. When she pinned the article to the wall, she stood back and looked at it for a long moment. Then she sat down and wrote 12 pages without stopping. The fight was 6 weeks away. It had not yet happened, and it was already changing things inside people who had never met either man and never would. In Hong Kong, Bruce Lee finished his last filming obligations for the month with a clean, enough-focused efficiency that his crew read as calm and his director read as distraction. It was neither. He was already in Iceland. He had been there in his mind for weeks, walking the frozen ground, calculating what the cold would cost him and what it would cost Torsten, and where those 2 costs were different. He knew cold slowed the extremities first, the hands, the feet, the fine motor chains that precision striking depended on. He knew it compressed the body's willingness to commit to speed. He knew that for a larger, heavier man built by decades of outdoor physical labor, the cold was not an obstacle, but a familiar condition, a home. He trained for it. He opened the windows of his training room in the cool hours before dawn. He ran in the early mornings when Hong Kong was at its coldest. He worked on maintaining sharpness in conditions that argued against it, repeating combinations until the slight stiffness in his hands became something his nervous system accounted for automatically, rather than fought. He also thought every single day about one line from Torsten's letter. If you are asking because you want to win, do not come. He had turned that sentence over more times than he had turned over any technique, any theory, any idea from any book or teacher in years. Because the honest answer, the only kind of answer Bruce Lee had ever allowed himself, was that he did not know. He wanted to know the truth. He wanted to find the edge again. He also wanted to win. All 3 of those things were true at once, and 2 of them pointed the same direction, and 1 of them pointed somewhere else entirely, and he was still working out what that meant. At the harbor in Reykjavik, life went on the way it always had. Ice and fish and cold and the smell of the sea before sunrise. Except that everyone who had known Torsten for years felt something in the air around him that had not been there before. Not tension, not nerves. Something they could not find the right word for. The way a bay feels different in the hours before a big storm arrives. Not frightened, just awake. Aware of something coming. Old Gunnar Olafs found him on the dock 3 weeks before the fight, standing at the water's edge with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the sea the way he had looked at the sea his whole life, like it was the one thing in the world that always told the truth. "Are you afraid?" Gunnar Olafs asked. Torsten thought about it genuinely, and with his eyes still on the gray water. "I am something," he said. "I just don't know the word for it." Gunnar Olafs nodded. 50 years on the North Atlantic, he knew feelings that had no words. "The whole world is watching now," the old man said. "Yes," Torsten said. "Does that trouble you?" Torsten was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and looked at Gunnar Olafs with those calm, weathered, still eyes. The eyes that had never changed since he was 17, bleeding hands on the stone steps, looking at something inside himself he couldn't yet name. "It troubles me," he said, "that it doesn't trouble me more." Gunnar Olafs turned that over for a long time afterward. He was still turning it over on the night of February 14th, standing packed into the far end of the stadium with 48,000 other people, his breath rising white into the frozen dark above Reykjavik, watching two men walk toward each other across the ice. By then, he thought he understood. February 13th, 1973. Temperature 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind from the north. The kind of cold that does not announce itself loudly. It does not howl. It does not perform. It simply sits in the air like a fact, pressing against every window, working its fingers under every door, settling into the stones of the street and the bones of anyone standing on them. By the time you notice how cold you are, you have already been that cold for a while. Bruce Lee arrived in Reykjavik at noon and was driven directly to a hotel near the city center. He did not go to the stadium. He did not meet the press, who had gathered outside the hotel in a pack so dense that the hotel manager had called the police. Not because there was any trouble, but because 40 journalists in a lobby designed for 12 was a fire code violation, and everyone could feel the situation getting worse. Bruce went upstairs without stopping. He did not wave. He did not perform the small pantomimes of accessibility that famous people learn to perform. He was done with the day by the time he reached the room, already somewhere internal, already tomorrow. He had asked for a specific meal: rice, steamed vegetables, clean protein, nothing heavy in the stomach, nothing that would sit wrong in the cold. He ate it alone by the window, while the Icelandic afternoon, gray, brief, impressing toward dark before 4 o'clock as though the sun had somewhere better to be, flattened itself against the glass and faded. His manager and closest friend, Clarence Wu, sat in the chair by the small desk with a folder of documents he was not reading. He was watching Bruce watch the window. He had been watching Bruce for 3 days with the same expression, the one he could not entirely put away no matter how professionally he tried to arrange his face. "You don't have to do this," Clarence said. It was the 4th time that week he had said it. He knew it was the 4th time. He said it anyway because some things need to be said, even when the person who needs to hear them has already heard them and decided. "I know," Bruce said. The 4th time that week. Clarence set the folder down on his knee. He is 60 pounds heavier than you?" "Yes." "He has never lost. Not once in over 60 fights." "Yes." "The ground will be ice. It will work against you far more than it works against him. He was built in the cold. You were not." "Yes," Bruce said, the same quiet tone for all of it. None of the yeses heavier than any other. Each one a simple acknowledgement of a true thing. Clarence was quiet for a moment. Then he took the folder off his knee and set it on the desk with the careful deliberateness of a man putting something down so that his hands are free to say something real. "Bruce, tell me why." Bruce turned from the window then. The gray Icelandic afternoon light was on his face. The thin, cold, honest light of a country with no interest in making anything look better than it was. When in that light his face was both younger and older than 32. He looked like a man who had been thinking about one question for a very long time and had arrived through all the thinking, not at an answer, but at a place where the question finally felt like home. "Because I don't know what is on the other side of this," he said, "and that is the only place left that still interests me." Clarence looked at him for a long, full moment. Then he picked up his folder, opened it, and pretended to read. "Try not to get frostbitten," he said. At the other end of Reykjavik, in the house with the good windows and the good stove that Torsten had spent years making into a real home, dinner was already finished and the table had been cleared, and Frost the wolfhound was a warm, breathing gray shape in front of the stove. The kitchen smelled of lamb stew and dark bread, the kind of dinner that makes no promises and keeps all of them. Outside, the February dark pressed against the windows, and the wind off the North Atlantic moved through the street with its cold, patient, indifferent authority. Rana sat across the table from Torsten. She looked at him in the way she had always looked at him, not searching for something, not monitoring for signs, just seeing him. That was one of the rarest things she gave him, and one of the things he needed most. The experience of being seen without being assessed. "How are you?" she asked. Not "how will it go?" Not "are you ready?" Not "do you think you can win?" How are you? The question underneath all the other questions. Torsten looked down at his hands flat on the table in front of him, when he had been returning to his hands a great deal in the past weeks. Not in the way a fighter measures weapons before a battle, calculating edge and force. In the way a person looks at the record of their own life written in the thing most used to live it, the calluses from the nets, the old scar on the left knuckle from a dock cleat in 1961, the slightly crooked little finger that had been broken twice and set badly both times because he had never gone to a doctor for it, the hands of 35 years of everything he was. "When I was 11, he said, and I hurt that boy on the dock. I came home and I could not sleep, not from guilt, because I had found something inside myself that I did not recognize and did not know how to carry. I spent the next 20 years learning how to carry it. A question learning what it was." He was quiet for a moment. In the stove, a log shifted and settled. Frost exhaled deeply in his sleep, some dog dream moving through him. "Tomorrow," Torsten said, "I find out if I understood it correctly. If what I think I found is what I actually found." Rana reached across the table and set her hand over his. A nurse's hand, warm, steady, completely without doubt. The hand of someone who had held frightened people through the worst hours of their lives and knew the difference between comfort that helped and comfort that only asked to be forgiven for failing. "And if you were wrong about it," she said. He looked at her across the table. Those still, gray, entirely honest eyes. "Then at least I'll know," he said. "That is still better than not knowing." She held his hand for a moment longer. And then she stood and finished clearing the table, moving around the warm kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a person entirely at home in their own life. And Torsten stayed at the table a little longer, listening to Frost breathe and the stove settle and the wind press against the good windows that had kept them warm for years. Then he went to bed. He slept 8 hours. He did not dream. In the morning, everything would be decided. But tonight the house was warm, and the dog was sleeping, and the woman he loved was in the next room. Tonight there was nothing else to do, and nothing else to be. Tonight was enough. He closed his eyes. Outside, the North Atlantic wind moved through Reykjavik in the dark, finding every gap, counting every crack. It's carrying the smell of the ice that tomorrow 48,000 people would stand on the edge of and hold their breath above, while two men walked out to the center of it and did something that had never been done before and would not be done again. The temperature dropped another degree. The city slept. February 14th, 1973, 7 p.m. The temperature was 15 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind had died. That last part mattered more than people understood until they were inside it. On any other February night in Reykjavik, the wind off the North Atlantic would have made 15 degrees feel like something far worse, would have driven the cold through every layer and into the bone, made standing still in the open air for 2 hours a question of survival rather than spectacle. But tonight the air was almost perfectly still. The cold sat in it flat and total and absolute. The way cold sits when there is nothing moving to remind you it is there. You breathed it and your chest registered it and your skin knew it. But there was no cruelty in it tonight, just the fact of it. The sky above Reykjavik was clear from horizon to horizon and packed with stars. The particular density of stars you only see when you are very far north and very far from the nearest city bright enough to argue with the dark. They were not decorative. They were simply there, all of them, every one, doing what they had been doing since before any human being had ever looked up and tried to count them. The stadium was full. Every seat, every standing section, every aisle that could hold a body was holding one. 48,000 people arrived from 12 countries, and I wrapped in everything they owned against the cold. Hats pulled to eyebrows, scarves pulled to cheekbones, faces visible only in the narrow horizontal band between those two things, nothing showing but eyes. Eyes that had not looked away from the center of the stadium since the gates opened. Their breath rose together into the air above the stands and hung there, pooling and drifting in the still night, a low, warm cloud generated by 48,000 living bodies pressed close in the cold. The stadium lights drove down through it in thick white columns. From above, from those stars, it must have looked like something on fire. The fighting surface at the center had been treated, a chemical application that gave the ice texture enough to stand on without removing the fact of what it was. Ice. Real ice. Are in real February, Icelandic cold. A rope boundary marked a circle 40 feet across. Inside the rope, there was nothing. No chairs, no equipment, no officials, no padding, no corners. Just the ice and the light and the cold air, waiting. At the far end of the standing section, pressed against the railing behind a very tall man from Sweden, a 14-year-old boy from Oslo named Erik Selberg stood on his toes. He had arrived the previous day on a ferry, then 2 buses, then a long walk in the dark carrying everything he owned in a single bag. His cheapest available ticket put him here, at the farthest possible point from the circle, behind the tallest possible man. He had spent the entire weight on his toes. He could see almost nothing. He would tell the story of this night for the rest of his life anyway. Because what you see at something like this is not the whole of what you receive from it. At 7:45 exactly, the PA system came on. The announcer spoke first in Icelandic, then in English. The words were these: "Ladies and gentlemen, the contest will begin in 15 minutes. Nothing more. No names, no records, no histories, no statistics about weight or reach or unbeaten streaks, no music." Both men had been clear about this. There would be no theater. The thing itself would have to be enough, or it would be nothing. When the announcement ended, the crowd did not roar. It inhaled. One single collective intake of breath, 48,000 lungs drawing in at once, and then a silence that fell over the stadium like a physical weight. People in the upper sections reported afterward that in that silence, in the complete and total absence of crowd noise in a full stadium, they could hear the ice at the center of the arena cracking, the cold contracting it, the ground reminding itself of what it was. At 8:01, Torsten Bjornvik walked out. He came through the tunnel entrance alone. No entourage, no music, no signal beyond the simple fact of his appearance. He wore dark trousers and a gray long-sleeved shirt. No coat, no hat, no concession to the temperature beyond the fact of having lived the whole of his life inside it. He walked across the ice toward the rope boundary with the same stride he used to walk to his boat in the morning. Unhurried, waitful, entirely sure of where each foot was being placed. He stepped over the rope without breaking stride. He stood in the center of the circle with his arms loose at his sides and looked at nothing in particular, the way a cliff face looks at the sea. His breath rose in the cold air, steady, slow, even. The crowd found its voice then, not cheering exactly, not applause, but something that fell between both. An acknowledgement, the sound that forests make when something significant passes through them without asking permission. 30 seconds later, Bruce Lee walked out. He wore black training trousers and a dark shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows. The exposed forearms in 15-degree air were not bravado. They were information. He was telling the cold the same thing he told every opponent. "I know you are here. I am not pretending otherwise. Let us proceed." When he walked with the walk that anyone who had ever watched him move would recognize before they recognized his face. Every step landed with perfect distribution, his weight committed and never wrong, his center low and certain, his eyes already on the rope, already on the circle, already on Torsten. He stepped over the rope. He stood 15 feet away from the man he had watched on film in a dark room in Hong Kong. The man he had spent 11 days in a boat shed with. The man whose face had shown him the only stillness he had ever seen outside his own. They looked at each other. The stadium went completely, totally, absolutely silent. 48,000 people, 15 degrees Fahrenheit, stars in a black sky overhead and a cloud of 48,000 breaths hanging below them, and two men standing on the ice at the center of it all, looking at each other across 15 feet of frozen ground. No referee appeared between them. They had agreed on this. Halvard stood at the rope boundary with instructions to enter if something truly went wrong. Nothing truly went wrong. They stood without moving for what witnesses later measured at 90 seconds and described as much longer. The particular dilation of time that happens when something important is about to begin, and every human nervous system in a quarter-mile radius is recording it with everything it has. Neither man moved. Both men breathed. The twin clouds of their breath drifted forward in the still air, out across the 15 feet between them, and met somewhere in the middle. Then Bruce shifted, not an attack, not even a step. A redistribution of weight so small and so precise that most of the 48,000 did not register it as movement at all, only as a change in the quality of the space around him, as though the air itself had been informed of something. Torsten's answer was equally invisible to most of the crowd. A settling, a lowering of his center by perhaps 2 centimeters, a tree acknowledging a wind that had not arrived yet. And then, between one breath and the next, between one heartbeat and the next, they were fighting. No signal, no ceremony, no wind-up. One moment the two men were standing apart in the frozen circle, and the next they were in motion together. And the motion was unlike anything that any of the 48,000 had vocabulary for, because it was simultaneously faster and slower than anyone had been prepared for. Faster in its moments, Bruce's combinations arrived with a speed that was simply beyond normal visual tracking. Hands that materialized at the target before the origin of the movement was fully processed, each strike placed with a precision that was not about power, but about exactness, about finding the one location among all possible locations where contact was worst for the receiver, and arriving there before any defense could assemble. Slower in its architecture, neither man was rushing. Both were reading. The reading was deep and patient, the way experienced fishermen read weather. Not looking at the surface, looking at everything the surface was the result of. Torsten moved with the weight and the inevitability that Niels Svensson had once compared to a glacier. Unstoppable not because of force alone, but because of the sheer accumulated mass of intention behind every movement. But the thing, the true thing, the thing that separated what was happening inside that rope circle from anything the world of combat had produced before, was this. Both men knew what the other was doing. Not suspected, not guessed, knew. They had both found, by entirely different roads across entirely different lives, the same interior territory, the place where you can read intention in the micro shifts of muscle before the muscle completes its action, where the future of the next 2 seconds is visible in the present of this one. When that ability met itself across 15 feet of Icelandic ice, the result was not a collision of two superior fighters. It was a conversation. Two rare instruments, built separately over decades, finally playing the same piece. At the far end of the stadium, standing on his toes behind a tall man from Sweden, Erik Sellberg was crying. He did not know why. He could barely see what was happening. He would not be able to explain it afterward, would try and fail for the rest of his life to put the right words around it. He would only ever say, in classrooms, in gymnasiums, to students who watched him with careful eyes, that it was the most beautiful thing he ever saw. And he was barely seeing it at all. The fight lasted 22 minutes. That number, the 22, would be written in hundreds of articles and books and documentary scripts in the decades that followed, always with the same slight air of disbelief. The way people state facts that feel like they should be larger. 22 minutes for the thing that had taken both men their entire lives to arrive at. 22 minutes watched by 48,000 people standing in 15-degree cold without once looking away. In those 22 minutes, both men were hurt, not broken, not overwhelmed, but genuinely, honestly, evidentially hurt, in ways that left marks lasting weeks, that showed up in the mornings afterward when each man sat up in bed and took inventory. Torsten landed 3 strikes that Bruce described later to Clarence, are in the quiet of the hotel room with his shirt off and the bruising already deep and visible, as the hardest contact he had ever received in his life. Not the fastest, the hardest. The kind of impact that seemed to contain more mass than the body delivering it could physically account for. As though those dock mornings and those net hauls and those 4 a.m. winters had compacted themselves into something denser than flesh, something closer to the sea floor. Bruce landed strikes that Torsten told Halvard a week later that he had seen coming and still could not prevent. Not because his reflexes had failed him, because the space between seeing and responding, the tiny corridor of time that a defending body needs to convert perception into movement, had been collapsed by something operating at a speed his nervous system simply could not match. He had seen the strike. He had sent the signal. The signal had arrived 1 fraction of 1 second too late. Against every other man he had ever faced, that gap had not existed. Against Bruce Lee, it was the entire contest. Both men went down once. Bruce went down at the 11-minute mark. Torsten caught him coming out of a combination, a sweep that found the left foot half a step ahead of where it should have been on the ice. And the ice was ice, and there was nothing to recover on, and Bruce went down. The fall was fast, and the landing was controlled, and the rise was something that Niels Svensson, to standing just inside the rope boundary where he had no permission to be, later described as the single most astonishing physical act he had ever witnessed. Less than 2 seconds from contact with the ice to full standing, weight balanced, hands back up, eyes never having left Torsten's face for the entire duration of going down and coming back. The stadium received it with a sound like a wave breaking against a seawall, not a cheer, something involuntary and massive, the noise that comes out of 48,000 people when their collective nervous system is overwhelmed without warning. Torsten went down at the 17-minute mark. Bruce had been studying him for 17 minutes with complete attention. And what he had found, what the 11 days in the boat shed had taught him to look for, and what 17 minutes of real contact had confirmed, was a specific gap, a fractional delay in the right side's response when Torsten was shifting weight left. A door that opened for less than 1/4 of a second at a specific moment in a specific sequence. A door that could only be used by someone fast enough to see it while it was open and move through it before it closed. Bruce built the sequence for 11 minutes. He constructed it the way a carpenter constructs a corner, piece by piece, each part making the next part possible. And at the 17-minute mark, he walked through the door. Torsten went down the way large things go down, slowly enough that you could see the full weight of it, or heavily enough that the impact carried through the ice and into the ground below. He was down for 4 full seconds, which was longer than Bruce had been down by 2 seconds, and those 2 seconds meant something different to the 48,000 than any other 2 seconds of the night. And then Torsten rose. He placed one hand on the ice, then one knee, and he rose with the same unhurried deliberateness with which he did everything, as though he had simply decided to be on the ground for a moment and was now deciding to be elsewhere. He stood. His eyes found Bruce's eyes. He had not looked away. They looked at each other from the ice. They were both breathing hard, steam rising off their shoulders and arms in the frozen air. The 22 minutes already written on both their faces in the particular, honest language of real effort, the tightness around the eyes, the slight heaviness of the jaw, the quality of breath that has been working. And here is the moment. This is the moment. The one that 48,000 witnesses never stopped arguing about, never stopped trying to find the right words for. The one that journalists wrote 3 different versions of and still felt the true version had escaped them. The one that Fujimoto Kenji in Osaka read about in 5 separate accounts over 3 months, and then sat within his garden for an entire afternoon before he believed he understood it. They smiled. Not the smile of a man who has an advantage, not the performance smile that fighters learn to wear to unsettle an opponent. Not relief, not satisfaction, not the particular narrowing of a face that happens when someone thinks they are winning. Something else entirely. The smile that arrives on a person's face when, after a very long search, they have found the thing they were looking for, and found it in the same moment that the person across from them has found the same thing. Recognition. Mutual and simultaneous and completely unguarded. They had found each other, in the middle of the ice, in the middle of the fight, after everything. Then they kept fighting. The last 5 minutes were unlike the first 17 in a way that everyone in the stadium felt and nobody could name. The tactics were gone, not because either man was too tired to use them, but because the conversation between them had moved past the place where tactics lived. They were no longer reading the fight in order to answer it. They were doing something that existed past competition, past contest, past the whole vocabulary of winning and losing. Something that belonged to a place the crowd could feel the existence of, even though no one present had a map to it. At the 22-minute mark, both men stopped. No one fell, no one tapped, no one was stopped by injury. They simply, simultaneously, as though a signal had sounded that only the two of them could hear, ceased. They stood apart in the frozen circle, breathing hard, steam rising off both of them, their faces carrying every second of what they had just done, and underneath all of it, visible to anyone watching closely enough, something that looked very much like peace. The stadium was so silent that Erik Selberg, standing on his toes at the far end of the standing section, could hear his own heartbeat. Then Torsten Bjornvik walked across the ice toward Bruce Lee and held out his hand. Bruce Lee took it. The grip held. And then, and this is the thing, the irreducible specific thing, the thing this entire story has been walking towards since a 17-year-old boy stood bleeding on stone steps in the Icelandic dark. Bruce Lee bowed. Not theater, not ceremony, a real bow. The kind that means only one thing in every language and every culture that has ever used it. I see you. I see what you are. I acknowledge it completely with everything I have, without reservation and without performance. He held it for 5 full seconds. His eyes were closed. And Torsten Bjornvik, who had grown up on the docks of Reykjavik, who had never in his life bowed to any man or anything, who did not have the gesture anywhere in his cultural inheritance, who would not have known how to perform it even if he had wanted to, bowed back, slowly, genuinely, as though his body had simply understood what was being said and answered in the only honest way available. The crowd broke, not into cheering. Cheering was too small and too specific for what came out of 48,000 people at that moment. It was something larger and older and less organized. The sound of a mass of human beings witnessing something true and being unable to hold the experience of it inside their individual bodies any longer. It rose from the stadium into the still Icelandic night and climbed toward the stars, and the stars paid it no particular attention. Or because stars are old and they have seen things, but the sound was real and it was enormous, and it was the only appropriate response to what had just happened on the ice. At the far end of the standing section, Erik Selberg screamed until his voice was entirely gone. He did not know what he was screaming. He did not need to know. Some things do not require words. They only require the willingness to let them move through you without stopping them. He let it move through him. Who won? 3 words. The question traveled faster than the people who had been there could walk to their hotels and change out of their frozen clothes. It was in the bars of Reykjavik before midnight. It was in the wire services before sunrise. By the following morning, it was on the front pages of sports sections in 11 countries and inside the mouths of every person who had been in the stadium and every person who had heard about it from someone who had been in the stadium and every person who had simply seen the headlines and felt the pull of the question without knowing quite why it pulled so hard. Who won? It was asked in bars and gymnasiums, in living rooms and school corridors, in martial arts schools in Tokyo, Hong Kong, Los Angeles, and Amsterdam, where instructors stopped mid-demonstration and their students asked, and the instructors did not answer right away because they were not sure. In the letters, hundreds of them, with then thousands, that arrived at Halvard's office and at the production company in Hong Kong, and at the sports desks of every publication that had sent someone to Reykjavik. Each letter asked the question in its own way, and all of them were asking the same thing underneath. Tell me there is an answer. Tell me this resolves the way things are supposed to resolve. Tell me there is a number on the scoreboard. There was no number on the scoreboard. The fight had no judges, no scorecards, no referee's decision. It had ended not in a fall or a submission or a stoppage, but in a mutual acknowledgement that had no name in the sports world because the sports world had never needed a name for it before. A mutual acknowledgement does not resolve into a winner and a loser. It resolves into something else entirely. So something the sports pages of 11 countries had no category for and spent 3 weeks trying to invent one. Halvard held the press conference the morning after, in a hotel meeting room that had too many journalists in it and not enough chairs. He stood at the front and he said, in the flat voice of a man stating something he knows is inadequate but cannot improve upon without lying, it was a draw. The room was immediately and loudly unhappy with this. They pressed. Who hit harder? Who landed more? Who went down worse and stayed down longer? Who was faster? Who was stronger? Who controlled the center of the circle more of the time? Who looked more tired at the end? Who, if it had continued another 10 minutes, would have been the one still standing? Halvard answered every question with the same care and the same honesty, and each answer pointed somewhere slightly different from the last. And the total of all the answers was not a picture of a winner. It was a picture of two men who had been, across 22 minutes, genuinely and completely each other's equal in ways that were not the same ways. Like two different mathematical proofs arriving at the same answer by routes that shared no steps. By the end of the press conference, the only thing the room agreed on was that something had happened in the stadium the previous night that did not fit inside any existing frame, and that this was somehow both the most interesting and the most frustrating thing that had ever happened to a sports press conference. Nils Svensson had been inside the rope, where he had placed himself there before the fight began and had not been removed because Halvard had looked at him, weighed the cost of an argument, and decided the night had larger concerns. Nils stood close enough to hear the breathing of both men across 22 minutes. The way it changed, deepened, found its second floor, kept going. He left the stadium at 10:30 with ice on his boots and his notepad full and went directly to his hotel room and sat on the bed still wearing his coat and wrote for 4 hours without stopping. The piece was published in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and the United Kingdom under 4 different titles. It contained no result, no winner, no loser, no verdict. It described 22 minutes the way you describe an eclipse or a storm, as a phenomenon that happened because the conditions for it existed and that left the world measurably different when it was over, without the world being able to say exactly how. 2 days after the fight, Bruce Lee gave a single interview. He gave it to Masuda Taro, a Japanese sports journalist who had been in the stadium and who had sent a handwritten request to Bruce's hotel rather than joining the pack of typed requests from larger publications. Bruce had appreciated the handwriting. He agreed to 40 minutes. Matsuda published the full transcript. I know most of it was careful and measured and precise in the way Bruce Lee was careful and measured and precise when he talked about things he had actually thought about rather than things he was performing thinking about. But one passage became the one that was extracted and reprinted and pinned above desks and written in the inside covers of notebooks and quoted in papers and arguments and eulogies for 50 years afterward. It said, "There is a truth inside fighting that has nothing to do with winning. Most people who compete never find it. Some people spend their whole lives trying to find it. A very few are born already close to it and spend their lives walking toward it. Torsten Bjornvik is one of those people. We met in the middle. What we found there I have no language for, not in any tongue I know, but I know it was true. I know because I have been searching for true things my entire life, and I can recognize them now. I recognize this." Torsten gave no interviews. He answered no letters. He returned to Reykjavik on the morning after the press conference, took the bus to the harbor, checked on his boat, collected Frost from Ragna's mother's house where the dog had been staying, and went home. He ate. He slept. The next morning he went back to the harbor before it was light. The training, when he returned to it, was different, not radically. The same beach, the same cold, the same pre-dawn darkness. But the quality of attention he brought to it had shifted in a way he noticed, but did not try to name. As though the question he had been training to answer had been answered, and now the training was something else. Not preparation. Something more like gratitude. A week after the fight, a package arrived from Hong Kong. Small, brown paper, his name in that small, precise hand on the outside. Inside, a single sheet of plain paper with 3 sentences written on it in the same hand. He read it standing in the boat shed with the door open in the cold morning coming in off the harbor. He read it once. Then he folded it into quarters along its own creases, with the care of someone folding something they intend to keep for a long time, and put it in the interior left pocket of his canvas jacket. The interior left pocket was where Torsten kept the things that mattered most to him. A photograph of his mother taken the year before she died. The key to his first boat, long since retired. Now this. He never showed the note to anyone. When Ragnar asked what it said, he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was making sure his answer would be true. It said what I thought it would say, he told her. Which is, she said, that we should do it again sometime, he said. 4 months later, on a Tuesday in July, Halvard called. Torsten was at the harbor. Halvard said the words. Torsten said nothing. The silence between them lasted long enough that Halvard said, "I'm sorry," and Torsten said, "Yes." He hung up and stayed at the harbor for a long time after, standing at the water's edge with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the sea the way he had looked at the sea his whole life, as though it had an answer in it, as though it always had, and the only question was whether you were patient enough and honest enough to hear it. He stood there until the light changed. Then he went home. Torsten Bjornvik lived until 1997. He was 56 years old when he died. A heart attack in the early morning, in the bedroom of the house with the good windows, in the bed where he had slept for 30 years. Outside, it was February again, Iceland again. The sea wind pressed against the glass the way it always had, indifferent and permanent. The same wind that had pressed against those same windows on the night before the fight, on every night before and after, belonging to no particular year and no particular story. Just the wind, just the sea, still there. Frost had been gone for 18 years. There had been 3 dogs since, all gray wolfhounds, all sleeping across his feet at night the way Frost had. Each one different and each one the same in the ways that mattered. The last one, a young dog named Sol, was in the hallway outside the bedroom door when it happened, and Ragnar said afterward that Sol had known before she did. Ragnar was with him. She held his hand. He had not fought competitively after February 14th, 1973. Not because he could not. His body remained extraordinary well into his 40s. The docks and the cold and the decades of honest training, having built something that did not deteriorate quickly. He did not fight again because he had arrived somewhere. The thing he had spent 40 years walking toward had been reached, and the reaching of it had not been a victory or a defeat, but a completion. That was the only word he ever used for it. On the rare occasions, he used any word at all. Completion. The way a sentence completes. The way a tide completes. One, not an ending. A resolution into the next true thing. He fished for the rest of his life. He maintained his boat and his mooring and his quiet reputation at the Reykjavik harbor, where the men who had known him since he was a boy treated him the same way they had always treated him, with the particular combination of familiarity and respect that belongs only to people who have been known too long and too well to be performed at. He taught in time, not in any school, not with any method that had a name or a certificate attached. In the boat shed, on the frozen beach, at the edge of the harbor in the early mornings before the boats went out. Young men from Reykjavik found their way to him, and occasionally young men from farther away, were drawn by the story that refused to stop traveling, the story of a fisherman from Iceland who had stood on the ice with Bruce Lee in 1973 and had done something that 48,000 people had spent the rest of their lives trying to find the right words for. They came the way certain people find certain teachers, without quite knowing how, moving towards something they could feel the existence of before they could see it clearly. He turned most of them away gently. Some he did not turn away. In the summer of 1976, a 17-year-old boy arrived at the Reykjavik harbor carrying a single backpack and the memory of standing on his toes at the far end of the stadium 3 years before. His name was Eric Selberg. He introduced himself on the dock and told Torsten he had been there that night. During that he had cried and screamed and lost his voice, that he had been trying to understand why ever since, that he had tried to describe it to people and failed every time, that he had come because not understanding it was no longer something he could live comfortably with. Torsten looked at the boy for a long time. in the way he looked at everything he was deciding about, fully, without hurry, without performance. "Come back tomorrow," he said. 6 in the morning. Bring boots." Erik came back every summer for 4 years. What Torsten taught him was not technique. It was not a system or a style or anything that could be written in a manual or demonstrated on a stage. It was closer to a way of paying attention, a quality of presence in the body, an honesty about what was actually happening in any given moment, rather than what you hoped was happening or feared was happening. How to be still without being absent. How to see what was real before you decided what to do about it. Erik Selberg became a physical education teacher in Oslo. He taught for 31 years. He taught not how to fight, but how to be present. Not how to win, but how to see clearly. When his students asked where he had learned it, he told them the truth. From a man who learned it from the sea and from a fisherman's hard life, and from a single encounter on the ice with a man who had learned it from something too fast to catch and too honest to deny. Some of his students understood what he meant. Some of them went looking for their own version of it. Some of them found it. The thing kept moving forward through people, the way true things do. After Torsten died, Ragna went through his things carefully and alone, the way she did everything that mattered, without rushing, without performing her grief for anyone, simply being present with what was there. In the interior left pocket of his canvas jacket, she found 3 items. A photograph of a woman she recognized from other photographs as Astrid, Torsten's mother, taken the year before she died of fever when Torsten was 9. A small iron key, the key to his first boat, long since broken up and gone, and a folded piece of paper, soft from 24 years of being folded and unfolded and refolded along the same creases. The ink slightly faded at the fold lines, but entirely legible everywhere else. She read it. She sat with it for a long time. And then she did something Torsten would not have predicted, but would not, she felt, have objected to. She wrote a letter to the Bruce Lee Foundation in Hong Kong. She told them about the note. She said it did not belong only to one man. It belonged to what had happened between 2 men, to the thing on the ice, to the 22 minutes, to the bow, to all of it. And what happens between 2 people, she wrote, should be allowed to outlive both of them, because it belongs to the world that made them possible, not only to the men themselves. The foundation replied within a week. Yes, please send it. She sent it the following Tuesday in a padded envelope by registered post. The note has never been reproduced in full. The foundation, honoring Ragna's one request, has kept it private. But at a small ceremony in Hong Kong in 2003, 30 years after the fight, attended by a handful of people who had been there or been shaped by it, including an Oslo schoolteacher named Erik Selberg, who sat in the 3rd row and did not speak but did, at one point, close his eyes. The foundation's director read aloud the one line Ragna had given permission to share. It is this: "You were the only man I ever met who already lived where I was trying to go. You have been waiting since the first page. The promise was made at the beginning. On the night of February 14th, 1973, 2 men walked toward each other across the ice, and one of them did not walk away the same." Which one? Both of them. That is the true answer. Not a diplomat's answer, not a compromise. The only honest account of what 48,000 witnesses stood in 15-degree cold and saw. Both men walked out of that circle having been reached by something they could not have been reached by any other way, in any other place, by any other person alive. Both of them carried something out of the rope boundary and into the rest of their lives that had not existed in them before they walked in. But the deeper question, the one hiding inside the first one, worth more than any 22 minutes of ice and cold and bruising, was always this: who won? The answer is in the note. Bruce Lee believed Torsten had won, not the fight on the ice, the longer, harder, older contest, the one both men had been running their whole lives without knowing the other was running it too. In the contest to arrive at the truth of the thing, to find the place where fighting stopped being about fighting and became about something truer and harder to name. He believed Torsten had gotten there first, had been born closer to it, had walked toward it straighter and arrived before him. And Torsten, reading those 3 sentences alone in the boat shed with the sea outside and the dog at his feet, and the cold in the walls, believed the exact and complete opposite. That Bruce had seen in 11 days what had taken him 40 years. That the speed of that understanding was itself a kind of answer. That if they had fought 100 more times across 100 more years, the thing would always have lived between them. Alive and unresolved, and more interesting for being unresolved. The way the truest things always are. That is what left 48,000 people speechless. Not the result, what they saw. They saw two men who had each spent their whole lives climbing toward the same peak from opposite sides of the same mountain. And they saw those two men reach the top at the same moment and find each other there. They saw the recognition. They saw the bow. They saw what it looks like when two people are completely honest about what they found. The temperature was 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The stars were out over Iceland. And something true happened on the ice. Something that a 14-year-old boy from Oslo, standing on his toes behind a tall man from Sweden, felt pass through him and never fully left. That is the story. And that is the story of the night that left 48,000 people standing in the freezing cold, completely speechless. My two men, one ice, 22 minutes that neither of them and none of us will ever fully be able to explain. Before you go, I want to ask you one simple thing. Where are you listening to this from right now? Drop your city or your country in the comments below. Every single time I read through the comments on a video like this, I am amazed by how many corners of the world this community reaches. So tell me where you are. I read everyone. If this story moved you, if it gave you something to think about, something to feel, something to carry with you today, please hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second and it helps this story reach someone else who needs to hear it. Every like is one more person who finds their way here. And if you believe that stories like this one, stories about courage and honesty, and two people finding each other across every possible difference, are worth spreading, then subscribe to this channel. That is how we grow this community. That is how we keep going. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss what comes next. Now click on the video appearing on your screen right now. There is another story waiting for you, and I promise it is worth your time. Let's go.